One of the goals of the study of metaphysics is to give an ontology. That is to say, to give an account of the things that are real, to give a list of what exists, to give a list of the things that are real in this universe. For example, most of us would include atoms in our ontology, as well as people, cats, dogs, trees, teacups, and rocks. But there are rules for giving a good ontology. The first rule is the rule of non-contradiction. This one is non-negotiable, and it tells us you must make sure there are no contradictions in your description of reality. The second rule that must be mentioned is the rule of parsimony, which is also known as Occam's razor. This rule tells us we should keep our ontology as short as reasonably possible. The criterion of reasonableness is important here. We could simply say that nothing at all exists and thus satisfy the rule of parsimony very nicely. This would, however, be obviously quite unreasonable. Now, some metaphysicians think that what is reasonable to include is what has measurable effects, and that what does not have measurable effects should be cut off by the rule of parsimony. For example, the eliminativist tradition in metaphysics denies the existence of my stapler. It says that the stapler does not exist, only the particles it's made of exist. And what some of them say in defense of this proposition is that the particles have measurable effects, but all the measurable effects we associate with the stapler can be traced to the particles alone. The stapler itself does not add anything. So the only real thing there is the particles, not the stapler itself. Now, other metaphysicians disagree. One reason some of them disagree is the rule of common sense, and that's our third rule. The rule of common sense tells us we should keep our explanations of reality as close to everyday common sense as possible. We should not say that common ideas of things are false if we can avoid it. We should make our descriptions of reality include as much as possible of what common sense says exists, and exclude as little as possible of what common sense exclude as much as possible of what common sense says does not exist. Include as much as possible of what common sense says exists. Exclude as much as possible of what common sense says does not exist. Now, with these three rules, non-contradiction, parsimony, and common sense, you could do a pretty good job giving a good ontology. But there are other things to consider. There are other rules, and there is this appearance of tension between parsimony and common sense. So let's look at this in a little more detail. Common sense tells us that we have free will and that chairs, buildings, rocks, and staplers exist. And so the rule of common sense appears to tell us that we should believe they exist, that they are really real. But it can be a challenge to explain how these things can really be real if materialism is correct, and if all that exists is matter. So materialism is one of the simplest explanations of the universe there is. So it does very well satisfying the rule of parsimony. And so it appears that we have this tension between common sense and parsimony. Now, where the question of materialism is concerned, do we really have to negotiate this tension? Do we have to choose between these two rules? Here's a good way of looking at this question by dividing it into two questions. If we accept materialism, can we satisfy the rule of common sense as well as the rule of parsimony? And if we reject materialism, can we satisfy the rule of parsimony as well as the rule of common sense? My own position on this is that the rule of parsimony is itself a common sense principle, and it's very dangerous to turn common sense against itself. I think if we do so, we risk violating the rule of non-contradiction. So if common sense says something exists, I think we need a pretty high bar to overrule that. Parsimony alone does not measure up to that bar. So I think the rule of parsimony does not ever require us to violate common sense. Accordingly, if materialism cannot explain my stapler and all the other things that are under question here, and if we do not have a better reason to reject those things, then I think a good ontology should include them. Keep in mind those are pretty big ifs, and you should take them on a case-by-case basis. And here are some of the bigger cases to consider. The stapler, the rocks, the trees, the cats, the dogs, and so on. Things made of physical particles. And also the human mind. And also universals and also numbers. The rule of parsimony tells us to keep our ontologies as short as reasonably possible. But violating common sense, I think, is simply not reasonable, unless we have some good positive evidence that some principle of common sense is incorrect. So consider whether that is the case for each of the disputed questions. And speaking of those disputed questions, the one about the stapler and other things made of particles is examined in some detail by Phil and Sophie in the What Are Things playlist on this channel. There should already be a video on this playlist about the question of the mind and the body and the relation of the two, and that should be a fairly good introduction to that question. There should be 2 new videos following shortly after this one on the others that I've mentioned, universals and numbers. These are 2 other challenges to materialism that some have made, and it is at least possible to make a common sense defense of their existence. So stay tuned. Now, one of my students, I feel obligated to tell you, did not like my list of rules for metaphysics, and he gave me his own list of rules, and I thought it was very good. He left out 1 or 2 of my rules, and he included the principle of sufficient reason in his list of rules for metaphysics. The principle of sufficient reason tells us we should presume that everything has an explanation. There is a sufficient reason for the existence of everything that exists. Depending on how you formulate the rule, you might say there's an exception or the most fundamental realities. But it's probably better to say what Aquinas would say, and say the most fundamental realities, in Aquinas metaphysics that would be God, the most fundamental reality, singular, or realities, contains its own explanation, or has within itself its own explanation. And the power has gone off, but here it comes, it's back. All right. 2 other rules that must be mentioned are the rule of science and the rule of piety. The rule of science would come in a strong version or a weak version, and it is a very significant rule in the minds of contemporary metaphysicians. The rule of science in a weak version simply goes like this: do not defy science in your ontology. Do not allow your ontology to conflict with science. For example, if science says that electrons are real, we have to include them in our ontology. A strong version of the rule of science tells us something like this: if something is not recognized by science, do not include it in your ontology. Only allow what science considers in your ontology. For example, if science does not tell us anything about non-physical human souls, then we cannot include the soul in our ontology, according to the strong version of the rule of science. The rule of piety also comes in strong versions and weak versions. And there certainly are some living metaphysicians who adhere to the rule of piety, but it's more visible in certain other philosophers, such as some of the medieval metaphysicians. If the Bible says there are angels, we have to include them in our ontology. This is what the weak version of the rule of piety would say, at least if it's formulated with respect to the Bible. Other philosophers might formulate it with respect to the Bible and the Roman Catholic magisterium, or with respect to the Quran, or with respect to the Vedas or something. The rule of piety says take the authoritative religious text or the authoritative religious tradition and do not defy it. Do not allow your ontology to contradict that religious authority. A strong version of the rule of piety goes further and will say you cannot allow in your ontology anything that is not recognized by the religious authority. So, for example, if universals are not mentioned in the Bible, a strong version of the rule of piety says you cannot include them in your ontology. Now, I myself subscribe to weak versions of both the rule of science and the rule of piety. Now, at the time of the making of this video, you can expect to see in the topics playlist at least 3 videos on the subject of some things that might be included in our ontologies. 2 of them might have to wait a week or 2 to be released, but at the time of the making of this video, I am making those other videos. And the one on minds is already there. The ones that are coming are the ones on universals and numbers. And a 4th such topic, 4th such discussion of something that might be included in our ontology is covered fairly thoroughly by Phil and Sophie in the What Are Things playlist, and I recommend it.